While reading a book in the small dining area of a cafe, I was approached by a man who seated himself across from me without asking, offering only a hello as an introduction before pulling the seat out and placing himself therein. He sat leaning forward with bold, unchecked eagerness, his butt no doubt hovering above the seat. I refrained from closing the book I'd been reading, fearing that he'd take it as me accepting his unspoken invitation to talk. He wasn't unattractive, having a decent enough face, and dressed well, but he was uninvited. I'd chosen a seat in the corner by the window specifically for the purpose of being outside the sphere of socialization, which always existed within the center of the cafe. There, the tables were more closely pressed, and many times groups would merge together in polite cohesion, talking and laughing and ordering drinks for the entire, initially unrelated party. He remarked on my book, and I, as politely as I could, gave him a few scant details about the narrative, adding, so as not to seem rude, that I'd barely read it, and therefore couldn't provide much beyond what I'd said. He nodded, gave a few shallow responses, and expressed an obvious insincere desire to check it out sometime, and then his attention quickly returned to me, specifically my face. I kept quiet, preparing to politely, though firmly, reject any requests for my number or to hang out again. Not because I had any immediate issues with this man, but because I hadn't gone out to the cafe with the desire to be hit on by strangers. But instead, in a gesture of immense line-crossing boldness, he reached across the table and picked up my cup of Earl Grey tea and took a sip from it. I was appalled, and only managed to respond with an almost whispered, "Excuse me?" no longer having the breath to speak aloud. He smiled, nodded approvingly at the tea, not at my meek reaction, and then without hesitation, picked up and bit into my gingerbread cookie, indelicately ruining the wreath of buttercream frosting and coating of orange sprinkles arranged into his smiling face. If the first incredibly unhygienic violation of my personal space had been bold, this latest offense was borderline insanity. Not only had the cookie cost a whopping $6.50, but it was good. And now, I thought hotly to myself, because of this man's social obscenity, I can no longer enjoy the rest. I'd only taken a single wonderful bite, but for the first time in years, I found myself fuming, glaring at him and summoning within my chest all the fury of someone who had not angrily, cathartically expressed themselves since middle school. I closed my book and imagined myself slamming it into the man's boyishly grinning face, knocking loose teeth and bloodying his nose, and perhaps even blackening one of his eyes. But instead, I leaned forward and said with the measured though fiery vitriol of someone on the very cusp of an outburst, "Leave my table right now, or I'm calling the police." In my head, I figured that skipping the middleman, the store's management, and going right to the authorities would sufficiently scare him. Instead, as if responding to some ordinary casually asked question, he leaned back, wiping his mouth with one of my already used napkins, sighed, and said, "Well, I'd love to meet them, but don't you think we should spend some time together tonight? Just the two of us?" Ugh! My jaw dropped, and the fury drained from me at the blatant dismissal, the implied challenge of my statement. I looked around more so to give myself time to think of a response than to see if there was anyone watching the upsetting interaction. And having thought of a response, I returned my attention to the man who had, in the interim, taken another bite of my cookie, now chewing thoughtfully while looking at nothing in particular. "Why are you doing this?" I knew it was probably the wrong thing to say. I knew that it was unwise to put myself in the position of the person asking the questions, effectively ceasing any conversational authority I might have had. But I wanted to know, and wagered that he'd provide an answer if I asked the question with as much dignity as I could manage, given the circumstances. Wiping his mouth again, there hadn't been any crumbs on his clean-shaven face either time, he leaned forward, looked directly in my eyes, and said, "Because I want to, Abby. Your friends can come tomorrow, or we can go there if you'd like. But tonight, I think we should just stay home, relax in bed." I found myself laughing at this, laughing unintentionally, uncontrollably at the preposterousness of his words. My name isn't Abby, and the suggestion that he'd be so bold as to walk to the police station with me, the home of my friends, to turn himself in was so utterly ridiculous, a level of boldness unimaginable. I then suspected that he was actually crazy and had mistaken me for some friend and even considered forgiving his extreme rudeness. But then, as if to deprive himself of any potential impunity, he reached down, plucked my purse from the spot where I'd set it beside my chair, and after rifling through its contents, removed my car keys. "I'll drive. I've been wanting to pass by the Ellisons' house and see how their deck is going. Don't worry, I won't actually stop. Just want to see if I can gloat to Ted later at the barber shop about finishing ours first. You know how he's always going on about his amazing carpentry skills." My name isn't Abby, and I don't know any Ted or any other members of an Ellison family either. I watched, now openly, deeply unsettled, as this complete stranger twirled my keys around his finger. "He has your keys. Oh my gosh, he has your keys, Samantha. Get away, get away, get away." My inner voice screamed at me. The world around me seemed to condense into a single space, one in which I was now at the complete automotive mercy of some random, terrifyingly audacious stranger. I decided then to drop all pretenses of social grace, to discard all notions of redemption, and prepare to shout for the entire cafe to hear that he should give me back my keys and leave me alone. But just as I was about to stand and really give it to him, he put his hand on mine, leaned forward, close enough for me to smell the scents of my cookie and tea, and said, "Front right corner, blue jacket, single cup of coffee on the table. Hasn't taken a sip in the last 10 minutes. Phone leaning against the cup, the camera facing here. Has been positioned that way since you sat down, before I came over." My eyes remained locked on the man for just a moment as my brain struggled to momentarily ignore the physical violation of the man's hand, and then, pretending to scratch my leg, I turned to the side and glanced in the direction indicated, and saw, just as the man had described, the other man, sitting with his head in his hands, ostensibly staring ahead in boredom, while his phone sat leaning against his coffee cup, the camera aimed in the direction of my table. I convincingly scratched at my leg, and then turned to face the man in front of me, and smiled. A genuine smile of gratitude. He raised his eyebrows in acknowledgement, and then leaned back, respectfully removing his hand from mine, and letting my keys rest on the table between us. We sat there for a moment, both speaking loudly enough for the other patron to hear, carrying on the role play of our pretend life together. Eventually, that other man stood up, theatrically stretched and yawned, and grabbed his phone. My husband, standing at the same time, politely excused himself from the table and walked over to the other man. I watched, amazed, as he exhibited yet another moment of charismatic boldness, taking the man's phone from his hands and examining it without permission. My pretend husband checked the man's protest with an incontestably raised finger and proceeded to probe the contents of the commandeered phone, his finger flicking through menus and images while his expression grew increasingly grave. Once he found what he'd been looking for, he pointed an accusatory finger at the man, who shrunk back as if struck, and then walking back to my table, my husband held the man's phone out to me. I took it and found a video opened on the screen, its duration nearly 14 minutes long. The video showed me sitting by myself, gazing out the cafe's front window. 14 minutes focused on my table, on my body. 14 minutes of creepily recorded footage. Sickened and yet darkly curious, I swiped through the rest of the videos and felt my stomach turn as I found more. Not only more videos of myself, from several previous visits to the cafe, but of other women as well. The entire collection of stealthily recorded footage from various angles in the cafe and other restaurants of the area, some of the more quirkily embellished interiors immediately recognized despite the occasionally awkward angles. He was a serial offender. Had taken, according to the gallery's information, 16 gigabytes of video in the last few months. all of women who'd been entirely oblivious to his digital violations. When I found the videos of the man walking behind women on sideways and in alleyways, I pushed the phone back to my pretend husband's hands and turned away so that my repulsion would not be seen by the deviant, in case he got off to that kind of thing. We of course called the police, keeping the man hemmed in with the help of the cafe staff, who had until that point thought of the man as a loyal and pleasant patron. I wanted to delete the videos of myself from the man's phone, but my pretend husband advised me not to, saying it was very important evidence and could be used to my significant benefit in court. I agreed, and when the police arrived, we handed over the phone with all its deplorable content left undisturbed. Relieved, though also emotionally exhausted, I planned to return home and sleep or make myself some coffee and try to take my mind off the ordeal with a long night of reading. But before I could gather my things, my pretend husband asked if he could repay me for my misappropriated tea and cookie. Sorely missing the taste of both, I graciously accepted, but the staff, perhaps fearing that I'd somehow blame them for the pervert's behavior, offered us whatever we wanted, free of charge. I repeated my earlier order, and the man ordered himself a coffee and a slice of lemon cake, commenting afterwards, "I really hated that gingerbread cookie." I thanked him for his stoic tolerance of it and his endeavor to keep up the charade, and we laughed together. "Well, since I haven't actually repaid you, how about I treat us to dinner later? We'll of course have something delivered since we're staying in tonight, right?" Unable to speak through a mouthful of deliciously spiced and generously frosted cookie, I smiled and slid my car keys into his hands.